This chessboard will have algebraic notation, so I'll get the CNC working on carving the male notation into ash while I work on preparing the walnut frame. For this project, I had already started to make a chessboard a couple of years ago, but then that client canceled the project. So I'm going to use that board and finish it up with the frame. It gave me the opportunity to offer a discount to this new client because I already had the chessboard on hand. Now I'll run the frame pieces through the jointer to flatten one face and one edge. I made extra male notation because I have several upcoming projects that also need notation, so it saves me a bit of time if I can make a larger batch at the same time. Now I'll cut a groove along the inside edge of each frame piece to fit over the plywood substrate that the chessboard squares are glued to. Next, I'll cut a rabbet that's 1/8 of an inch wide and 1/8 of an inch deep for the brass border to fit into. Since I'm not making the chessboard in this video, I thought it would be a good opportunity to show how some of my processes have changed as I've made more and more of these. This first change is when and how I add the brass border. Now I use CA glue to attach the brass because it's so easy to apply with a small tip, and it dries really quickly. I'm using Starbond CA glue, and I spray accelerant to the brass so that it bonds instantly. I also attach the brass early on in the process and before I cut the mitered corners of the frame. In the olden days, I thought I was clever by making this jig that I used to cut mitered ends of the brass pieces. I didn't insert the brass pieces until I had already mitered the corners of the frame, and then I had to painstakingly fit the brass to be the precise length. I used a grinding wheel and sandpaper to get everything to fit. It definitely worked, but it was tedious and time-consuming. It took me about 3 hours to cut all of the brass and to get it glued in place, versus about 15 minutes the way that I do it now. I also used to use epoxy to attach the brass. There's a trade-off between epoxy and CA glue. The CA glue makes my work much more efficient, but the epoxy gives a stronger bond. CA glue can be released by heat, so I need to be careful when I run the frame pieces with the brass through the drum sander because the heat from the friction can cause the brass to pop out. Next, I'll trim the edge of the brass. I do this with the brass side facing down to minimize the number of metal particles that will shoot towards me. I always wear a face shield when doing this. Next, I'll cut a groove along the outside edge of the frame to fit in some curly maple edge banding. I'll rough cut some curly maple on the bandsaw, and then I'll use the drum sander to get it down to the exact width of the groove. While that's gluing up, I'll start carving a shamrock into a small piece of ebony. I always carve the male pieces before carving the female pieces because the male inlay is much more likely to break. If I run into difficulties, that gives me the opportunity to adjust the size to minimize breakage, and then I'll adjust the corresponding size of the female portion. This is going to be a retirement gift for my client's father, so the shamrock and the father's initials will add personalization to the board. After doing the fine carving with a 30-degree V-bit, I'll switch to a 1/8 inch end mill to remove all of the remaining material. Now I'll trim off the excess edge banding, and then it's time to cut the miters. It's way more efficient to cut the miters with the brass already in place, and I can do this because brass is much softer than the blade in my table saw. I always make the first cut just a little longer than needed, and then I can trim each piece to the final length by sneaking up on the fit. With the miters cut, the next step is to carve the female notation into the frame pieces. This is the next big change in my process because I did not own a CNC router the first time that I carved algebraic notation. I printed out each of the letters and numbers and then used carbon paper to transfer those to the wood. And then I carefully carved out each one with a handheld router. It took me about 3.5 hours to do it by hand versus about 30 minutes to do it on the CNC. So that's another efficiency gain. And while the CNC is working, I can cut out all of the male inlay, so the time that the CNC is working is almost negligible. With my handheld carving of the notation, there's no way that I could have carved out the male portions to inlay, so I just filled them with epoxy. I'll glue in all the notation and let that sit overnight. The next day I cut off all the excess and then I ran the frame pieces through the drum sander. This is where I need to be careful that the brass does not get too hot, which would cause the CA glue to release. If I'd glued the brass in with epoxy, that would not be a concern. Now I'll glue in the frame pieces. This chessboard was made with Bolivian rosewood and curly maple squares. If you'd like to watch how I made a similar board like this, I'll put a link up at the top of the screen. The next day I ran it through the drum sander to remove the excess glue and get everything flat. And then I can head back to the CNC to carve the female portion of the Shamrock inlay. I left it clamped to the CNC and let the glue dry overnight. The reason I did that was because we were originally going to carve out in between the outline of the shamrock to put gold leaf, but the client and I both agreed that we did not want to overdo it with too much gold leaf because there were also going to be gold leaf initials next to this. So we just left the walnut showing between the outline portions. Next, the CNC will carve the father's initials. This took about 3 minutes. Now, let's contrast that with how I would have hand-carved initials before having a CNC. I started by tracing the initials onto the wood with carbon paper. Carbon paper used to be a staple in offices and schools, but kids nowadays probably don't even know what that is. And it's not easy to find anymore. Then I used a small set of chisels to carve everything out. And then I used a diamond Dremel bit as the last step to get everything smooth before applying the gold leaf. For the gold leaf, I start by sealing everything with this yellow sealer. It's kind of like using a primer for paint. After that dries for about an hour, I apply the sizing, which is the adhesive. I need to be sure that I apply it everywhere, but I don't want to use too much because I don't want to leave any puddles behind. So I made sure to spread it evenly and removed any excess. I let that dry for about 30 minutes, and then it's time to apply the gold leaf. I was able to do 3 initials with a single sheet. I just tapped it gently in place with a brush and then let it dry for a couple of hours. And then I sanded off all the excess and brushed out the remaining dust. Next, I used a trim router with a 16th inch roundover bit to ease the edges, and then finished up with a bit of hand sanding. Next, I'll use a 3/4 inch router bit to cut a finger groove on each of the 2 sides. Now it's time to apply the finish. I start with shellac, and I do this for 3 reasons. The most important reason when applying a finish to gold leaf is that it helps to seal it because I will be using a lacquer finish, and I've found that the lacquer can sometimes react with the gold leaf and cause it to bubble up. The other reasons are to seal the wood and to add a nice amber tone to the wood. As a final step, I'll spray on a few coats of pre-catalyzed lacquer, and then it's all done. So I gotta ask, would you make it?